Was this Thich Nhat Hanh that when he says, I heard these words?
Oh, no, this is, okay, so good question. So we're looking at the discourse on the teachings to be given to the sick. So this is, you know, right away, the title may bring up a lot of questions, but your question, I heard these words of the Buddha one time when the Lord was staying in the monastery in the Jeta Grove in Anathapindika's park near Shravasti. So this is not Thich Nhat Hanh. This is a translation of Thich Nhat Hanh's into English. It's a translation from I believe it's from the Pali. And this is how all of the Buddha's sutras begin. Thus have I heard, or in this translation, I heard these words of the Buddha. But the usually begins with thus have I heard. And so that makes it, kind of gives it the seal of the Buddha. It's a teaching of the Buddha. And originally these teachings were passed on orally. They weren't written down for a couple hundred years after the Buddha taught them. So his disciples, which he had a couple thousand, memorized these sutras. That's how they passed it on from one generation to the next. And there's a lot of, in the sutras themselves, there's a lot of repetition, and that's to make it easier to memorize. Now, that's why there's so much repetition here. Because if you want to remember it, you want to recall it, then you got to hear it again and again and again, even though it seems like us. So this is where we have to be really careful. One place we have to be really careful is we can get put off by the repetition that we find here and be like, didn't he say this already? I'm ready to go on to the next thing. I got that point. But this sutra is not meant to be just simply understand with our intellect alone. It's easy to understand. They're fairly easy to understand with our intellect. But when we experience them in a meditative perspective, from a body perspective, they go in differently. And it's kind of like rain. Rain, when it hits dry ground, it doesn't soak up. The dry ground doesn't soak it up right away, because it's so parched, the water just runs off. But the more it rains and the more the rainwater is able to soak in to the ground, then the ground begins to absorb what it's receiving. And the same thing for the Buddha's teaching. The more you hear them, the more it soaks in a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper. And the more that we meditate, the more we're open to them. So this teaching, this is from the Pali Canon, and these teachings are the foundation of Zen Buddhism. So we can't ignore them. In Zen Buddhist teaching it's built off of the early teachings of the Buddha. Without the early teachings of the Buddha, it's very difficult, I think, to understand Zen.
And is the early teachings and the sutras the same? The teachings are from the sutras, or the sutras are from the teachings?
Well, the early teachings of the Buddha are a little bit different from how Buddhism evolved. There's some shifts that took place historically over a several hundred-year period. So we got to keep that in mind, that the way that Buddhism was presented in the 5th century BCE is not the same as it was presented, and that's 5th century BCE in India, was not the same way that it was presented in 5th century CE of China. So there's a 1,000 years took place, and Buddhism evolved. And it evolved when it moved from one country to the next. And it's evolving now today, too, as it moves from Asia, from China, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, as it moves to Europe and United States. It's changing again. As Westerners meet this Dharma teaching, they have their own kind of understanding of it, and even in translating it from the language, the original languages, into English changes it. You can't help but change. You can't have a perfect translation. So we're looking through layers here when we look at this sutra.
So when we say Pali Canon, that's the original.
Yes, Pali Canon is referring to the original. These are the direct words of the Buddha. Now there are sutras that are said to be the direct words of the Buddha, but they didn't come until, say, anywhere between 300 and 600 years after the Buddha's death. So they're called the Mahayana Sutras. So there's a big shift there between the early teachings of the Buddha and then Mahayana Buddhism, which has a more of an inclusive appeal. The early teachings of the Buddha are almost more exclusively geared towards monks and nuns, people who are renunciants. And so that's why we have to be really careful with this teaching called Discourse on Teachings to be Given to the Sick. This is actually not just for anybody to hear. So that's one thing we really want to keep in mind. Here's the story. There's a story behind this. So there's a layman. The way Buddhism worked in India is that the monks literally had no home to be in. They were what's called a home leaver. And when I did my ceremony to called an initiation into the priesthood, the Zen priesthood, it's called Shukkei Tokudo, which means home leaving ceremony. And that was taken very literally in the time of the Buddha. Monks literally had no home. They would sleep in the forests that were adjacent to cities. They would sleep maybe in huts. And wealthy business people or kings would provide land for the Buddha and his disciples to live in. And they would move from place to place. So they were wandering ascetics, basically. They lived very, very simply. One meal a day. That was the rule, is to have one meal a day before noon. And that was to not tax the resources of the lay community. And so this is the kind of context out of which this was spoken. So the story is that a very wealthy layman named Anathapindika is on his deathbed. He's ill. And he's the one that donated a tremendous amount of land to the Buddha for his monks to live in. And the Buddha happened to be staying in Anathapindika's park called the Jeta Grove near the town of Shravasti. So this is the setting. And Anathapindika, being ill, he's on his deathbed, he wants to hear the teachings of the Buddha. Because it's considered, we got to bring our mind into the mind of an Indian culture, Indian society. It's very different from Western culture and modern culture even. In our culture, we don't have much of a sense of what happens after we die. We pretty much think, I don't want to speak in too general terms, but it's hard for us to imagine returning again, to taking that really seriously. But in Indian culture, that was a given. Reincarnation was a given, and you're going to come back. And it was not necessarily a good thing to come back again and again, because it's considered this whole life is suffering. And so you keep coming back until you resolve that suffering. Here, Anathapindika, he's on his deathbed, and he's coming from a worldview that's very different from ours. He knows that he's going to be coming back. It's not a question. It's not a belief. It's just that's what happens, And the transition between life and death is taken really, really seriously. And so you want to have a really good death, because that will ensure a really good rebirth, because the way that you die is going to determine your next life. If you have a really bad death, that energy of that moment at death will continue into the next moment. It doesn't go somewhere else. It's going to continue to move into the next moment. And so the best way to die is to have spiritual teachings in your mind, to make your mind calm, at ease, peaceful. And then when you're making that transition into the next life, that will be carried into the next moment. And the Tibetan tradition goes into great detail about this shift from life into death and back into life again. The Zen tradition doesn't go into much detail about it at all. We're not really so concerned. In the Zen tradition, it's more about living your life now and not putting too much emphasis on your next life. There's an awareness of it, but it's not really essential. So either way, we don't have to get too caught up in believing if it happens or not. The real question is whether the teachings that we hear provide some kind of relief from suffering or not. And that's the aim of the Dharma. The Buddha Dharma is the true Buddha Dharma when it offers relief from suffering. And even if it's the Buddha Dharma, if the words of the Buddha are there, but if it doesn't provide relief to suffering, then it's not the Buddha Dharma. Even if it's the same words of the Buddha, depends on its application. Just like medicine is good for certain illnesses, but one medicine isn't going to cure all illnesses. We have to have the right medicine for the right illness. And so this is exactly what this sutra is about. Teachings to be given to the sick. It's a particular form of medicine for a particular person, a very devout lay person. He was so devout that he donated tremendous amount of land to the Buddha, and he really found some peace in the Buddha's teaching. And he's on his deathbed, and he calls to the Buddha and asks, please send a disciple or two to teach me. I want to hear the Dharma. And so the venerables Shariputra and Ananda go to Anathapindika. They visit his home, and the first thing they ask him is how he's doing. And this is a great question for any of us. Like, you think about somebody ill in your own life, in your own family. Wouldn't you go to them, and when you go to them, you would ask, how are you? And really want to listen. Now, it's really, really difficult to hear what somebody who's sick has to say. I just want to say that straight up. It's not something that most of us have a high tolerance for. We don't want to hear that somebody's not doing well, And if we do, we try to explain it away quickly. Not for their benefit so much as oftentimes for our own, because we're very uncomfortable with illness. We're very uncomfortable with death. And so it's not something that we generally want to discuss or think about even. It's a very hard subject. But this is the first question. So we have to be, if we're giving teachings to the sick, you imagine yourself in the place of these monks of the Buddha, and they're there to give teachings to this benefactor. The first thing they ask is, how are you doing? And they are mentally and physically prepared to hear that. Sometimes we're not mentally and physically prepared to hear what somebody has to say, and it can blow us away. It can really blow us away. So we have to make sure we're really grounded. And these monks were really practiced monks, especially Shariputra, who was said to be the wisest of all the Buddha's disciples. So he was very deeply grounded. And Anathapindika, he says, first Shariputra says, how is your illness? Is it getting better or worse? Is the physical pain easing at all, or is it getting greater? Anathapindika replies, Venerable monks, it does not seem to be getting better. Who wants to hear that? It's not getting better. The pain is not easing. It is getting greater all the time. I mean, and if you read there's another version of this, and Anathapindika goes into great detail about how painful his situation is at that moment. Shariputra's response is, friend Anathapindika, now is the time to practice the meditation on the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So this is the first thing. Now, this is unique to this particular individual. That they're deciding. Shariputra is deciding. First is to take refuge or to understand the three jewels: Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Listen to what they're about. This is not going to be an appropriate teaching for just any sick person. You wouldn't just tell anybody off the street that's ill, let's take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. That would not be appropriate. They may have a totally different worldview.
My dad would have just looked at me.
Your dad would be like, get out of here. Right? Yeah. So, but Anathapindika, again, he's a devout layperson. He wants to hear this. So let's keep that in mind. This is something for him in particular. And Shariputra is meeting the need of this particular person. So he explains, first of all, what is the Buddha? What does Buddha mean? The Buddha has gone to suchness, is fully and truly awakened, has perfected understanding and action, has arrived at true happiness, understands the nature of the world, is unequaled in understanding. All of these epithets, this is what the Buddha is. Buddha literally means awake person, a person that's awake. It's a human being, not a god, but somebody that's developed themselves to a very high degree, and they understand the way the world works. And by honoring such a person, that's what it means to take refuge in the Buddha, not just in an external person, but also within ourselves. It's to see that we have the capacity to also wake up to the highest degree. So we're invited. Taking refuge in the Buddha is an invitation for ourselves to wake up to that capacity within ourselves. And then he goes on to the Dharma. The Dharma is the teaching of love and understanding. That the Tathagata is an epithet for the Buddha. It means thus come one. The Dharma is the teaching of love and understanding. That's the Dharma. Teaching of love, compassion and understanding. To be able to understand why the world is the way it is, or why a person is the way they are. That requires some degree of understanding. It may mean looking at the history of that person or of that situation. Things just don't pop up out of thin air. Things just don't happen. There's causes and conditions that precede them arising. And when we can see the causes and conditions that create a situation or the way a human being is, the way their personality is, then we have understanding. That's understanding. It's not just about that one person as if they were isolated individuals. So this is understanding and love that the Tathagata, the thus come one, has expounded. It is deep and lovely, worthy of the highest respect, very precious. It is the teaching that cannot be compared to ordinary teachings. It is the practice for noble ones. So these are, again, it's another invitation to absorb the teaching. The teachings, these are things that we can all practice. It's not just for an elite group of people, but it's an invitation for all of us to enter into the highest understanding. I like that. The Army says, "Be all that you can be." It's the same, no different here. Become all that you can. And then the Sangha. So this is the third one. The Sangha is the community of practice. So it means the people that are practicing together. It's you all. It's right here. Guided by the teachings, the Dharma, of the Buddha, the awakened one. So that's how these three work together. So the community gathers together, they practice the teaching, the Dharma, and they're guided by the Buddha. The community is also respected and precious. So each of you is respected and precious just for the fact of being here. It practices the precepts and realizes concentration, insight, and liberation. So those are the three. concentration. So that's what, when we're meditating, we're cultivating concentration. And concentration leads to insight. It leads to understanding about the way that things are. It leads to the understanding of the reality. And to liberation. So liberating your mind. We'll go more into what does that mean? What does that look like? What does a liberated mind look like? And then Shariputra goes on. So now Anathapindika has kind of been given teachings about taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. He's probably heard that many times. That's probably not the first time. And so the idea here is that when we're meditating, we have, or when we're hearing the teachings, we have to continue to remember to have an open mind, to have what's called beginner's mind, as if we've heard it only for the first time. This is the first time we've ever heard this. And so we want, even if we've heard it 100 times, 1,000 times, we want to hear it as though it's for the first time ever. And that's when it really, it can go in deeper that way. We might catch something that we didn't hear the time before. So Anathapindika, Shariputra then goes on to share more teachings. It's another very deep meditation. So he says, now is the time to practice the meditation on the 6 sense bases. And so the Buddhist understanding of what a human being is, and actually what the whole universe is called the 18 elements. Okay, the 18 elements. So the first 6, and this may seem like really obvious, but we don't pay a lot of attention to it. The first 6 are called the sense bases. The 6 sense bases. They are the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So those 6 are really foundational. And if we didn't have those 6, our lives and our universe, the way we see it, would be very, very different. Think about it. If we didn't have eyesight, if we didn't have hearing, if we didn't have smell, if you didn't have taste, this is how we perceive the world around us, through our, what we call in Buddhism, the 6 senses. And our mind, our thoughts also create the world that we see. All of those things. So what he says about these 6 sense spaces is really, really profound. He says here, and this is really a meditation, so I encourage you to think about this in a meditative way. These eyes are not me. I am not caught in these eyes. These ears are not me. I am not caught in these ears. This nose is not me. I am not caught in this nose. This tongue is not me. I am not caught in this tongue. This body is not me. I am not caught in this body. And this mind is not me. I'm not caught in this mind. This is a kind of an antidote to our ego attachment. Ego is that part of our self that wants to claim, that wants to grasp onto something and call it mine, call it me. It's that aspect of ourself that grabs onto something and says, this is who I am. Grabs on, this is who I am. The ego wants that for its own survival. But if we really look closely at our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind, we can see that it's constant flux, constant change. And so how can we grasp it? To grasp it is an illusion. To think that we've got it. To think that these eyes belong to me. I didn't create sight. I didn't decide to see. Did you? Did you decide to hear this talk? Did you decide to hear what I'm saying? It just goes in. The ears work. And the same with all the other senses. And smell. We don't do that. It's there. Taste. Isn't it a miracle to be able to put something on your tongue and you taste it and there's a flavor? how can, if you really think carefully about that and look at that, that's amazing. Like you put something on your tongue and it sends signals to your brain, and your brain's like saying either yes, whoopee, or get that out, you know? And our mind too. You can say the same thing. Our body's constantly changing. Our mind is changing. So the Buddha is saying, these are not yours. They're not self. And that's a foundational Buddhist teaching. This is not me. He goes on to the other of the 18 elements, and I won't go into them now, but I want to close with what Shariputra says about this meditation, because I think it's really helpful to kind of get this here. Here, friend Anathapindika, everything that arises is due to causes and conditions. Everything that arises has a cause, and it has conditions that maintain it. Everything that is has the nature not to be born and not to die, not to arrive and not to depart. When eyes arise, they arise, but they do not come from anywhere. They do not come from some place. When eyes cease to be, they cease to be, but they do not go anywhere. Eyes are neither non-existent before they arise, nor are they existent after they arise. Everything that is comes to be because of a combination of causes and conditions. When the causes and conditions are sufficient, eyes are present. When the causes and conditions are not sufficient, eyes are absent. It's just that clear. It's just that simple. When the causes and conditions are there for that existence to be there, it's there. And when they're not there any longer. The same is true of ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Form, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. Sight, hearing, and the consciousnesses based on the nose, tongue, body, and mind. The 6 elements, the 5 aggregates, and the 3 times. So even past, present, and future is not me. The past is not me. The future is not me. Even the present is not me. It's all of these things. All right. So these are things we can continue to meditate on. You know, we have some time this afternoon. So we can really look at that. You know, you can take a moment, look at your eyes. I mean, actually, I dare you. I challenge you to look at your eyes. You won't be able to see them. Even, you know, you can look in a mirror, but that's just your reflection. See if you can, you know, where do my eyes come from? You can go through that with all of the senses, body and mind. Where does this come from? You know, becoming inquisitive, curious. That's the heart of Zen, is curiosity. Okay, well, thank you for your attention.